And welcome everyone. As we were discussing environmental justice already during our coffee networks, it has a topic of very important in current times, and there's a lot activities that are going on. So we have four wonderful speakers today who are going to talk about environmental justice as an issue, but also how satellite data can help us to understand it better or address some of the issues. So with not furthering delaying, our first speaker is Susan Anenberg. She is associate professor at George Washington University and HAQAST team members and lead for Tiger team as well. So Susan, take over, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Pawan. And thank you all for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I'm going to give a joint presentation with Xiao, as we are the co-PIs of this Tiger team, Satellite Data for Environmental Justice. So what we're going to do today is just start broadly talking about the overall Tiger team and its objective. Then we're going to give a couple examples from our own research of how satellite data can be used for advancing environmental justice. And then we'll conclude with sort of where we are in the Tiger team. As Tracy mentioned earlier, we're in the middle of this first round of Tiger teams. So this is very much in progress. And we will give a bit of a progress update for the Tiger team and maybe say a few words about how to get involved. So this project started in September of last year, and it runs for about another year, a little bit more than a year. And what we aim to do is to meet stakeholder needs for identifying communities disproportionately affected by environmental health risks and estimating the benefits of governmental investments in environmental improvements for disproportionately burdened communities. As Pawan mentioned, there's a lot of activity going on in the government and elsewhere trying to identify disproportionately burdened communities and who would benefit from governmental investments. And so we're really hoping to use satellite data in novel ways to assist in that endeavor. And because satellite data is a relatively, environmental justice is, I would say, a relatively nascent use of satellite data, although it has been used for a variety of health risks in the academic literature at this point. It still is a little bit newer than some of the other uses of satellite data for health and air quality. And so as a result, we really want to build capacity among the environmental justice community for using and interpreting satellite data sets, and also vice versa among the satellite health and air quality scientists to understand how to use satellite data for environmental justice purposes. So our main focus, because it's quite a broad topic, and we cover a lot of different environmental health risks, our main focus we wanted to be relatively concrete about. And so what we would like to do is to focus on incorporating satellite data into environmental justice mapping tools. And because of that focus, we have a number of different stakeholders who are involved in this Tiger team. We also have a lot of HAQAST investigators. So thank you all to those HAQAST investigators and team members that are participating in this Tiger team. Quite a large effort. Our stakeholders range from people involved in developing national scale environmental justice mapping tools. So the US EPA's EJ Screen or the CDC's Environmental Public Health Tracking tool. The Council on Environmental Quality is developing a new climate and economic justice screening tool. So these national EJ mapping tools are a primary focus, but we also want to assist state environmental justice mapping tools. So we have a number of states that have their own tools, like for Maryland and California and Washington, DC and Texas. And so we're working with stakeholders in all of these different states to try to advance those tools as well. And then we are also connected with non-governmental or scientists and advocates and researchers working on broader satellite applications. And we'll hear from Environmental Defense Fund shortly. In terms of who we are, like I said, there's a lot of HAQAST investigators involved in this. Qian and I are co-leading it. We also have Gage Kerr, who is the principal coordinator from George Washington University, and Lauren Johnson, who's our communication specialist. And two data scientists, Nigel Martis and Xavier Noguera, who are helping us do things like turn data sets into GIS formats, for example, for easy integration into the EJ mapping tools. So this is the problem we're trying to solve right now, is that there are environmental justice mapping tools like EJ Screen on the bottom that are excellent tools, and they're used for a variety of different applications, again, to identify overburdened communities. And there are some data gaps and some possible additional data metrics and indicators that could be integrated into these EJ mapping tools that currently haven't been incorporated yet. And so we are seeking to bridge this gap between the scientists who have been developing new ways of using satellite data for studying environmental justice, bridge that gap to enable the data to be incorporated into EJ mapping tools. So this is an example of nitrogen dioxide observed from Tropomi, developed by Dan Goldberg and Gage Kerr, showing how NO2 concentrations are higher around warehouses, even higher actually than at the Dulles International Airport, and how NO2 concentrations are higher along Interstate 95 compared with the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, which prohibits trucks. And these are the types of things you can do with satellite data that we can explore in an easier to use graphical user interface if we were to incorporate these data into EJ mapping tools. So just to give a couple quick examples from my team of how we have done research using satellite data for environmental justice. Tracy Holloway mentioned this Earth Observatory post that was from November 9th, 2021. And it reports results from a paper that was led by Maria Castillo, who's now a student at MIT. And it really stems actually from the last HAQAST team. There was a Tiger team, the high resolution Tiger team, where we were engaged in developing high resolution concentration estimates. So it really stemmed all the way back then, but this is an example of how Tiger teams can have lasting effects, both in research and in applications, as this was only just recently published. But we studied the PM 2.5 health risks in Washington, D.C. and how those differ by neighborhood. We did this in partnership with Kelly Crawford from the DC Department of Energy and Environment and Anita Arno, who leads the DC Office of Health Equity. So they really wanted to understand, how do air pollution related health risks vary within the city, recognizing that we have very significant health disparities within the city, with about a 15-year life expectancy differential just within the city of DC. So we linked together satellite-derived PM 2.5 estimates from Randall Martin's research group from the Hammer et al. 2020 study, and combined that with local scale disease rates to estimate the air pollution disease burden and how that varies within city, and then line that up with demographics. So here you're seeing this dual color bar shows the percent of Black residents and PM 2.5 mortality risks. And we see that the eastern half of the city has significantly higher proportions of both, significantly higher air pollution health risks and significantly higher percent of population that is Black. And so this can be used by the city of DC to try to make determinations about where to invest resources to reduce air pollution, to reduce these inequities in air pollution related health risks. Another example is a study led by Gage Kerr, who looked at COVID-19 lockdowns and how those changed NO2 disparities across the United States using Tropomi NO2. And the only reason this study and the previous study are possible is because of the full spatial coverage and high spatial resolution of satellite data, or at least these satellite-derived concentration estimates, that allows us to look at a more granular scale and compare demographic variables at a granular scale as well. And so what Gage found is that pre-lockdown in 2019, we had NO2 concentrations observed from the Tropomi satellite that were much higher in the least white communities across the United States compared with the most white communities. And NO2 concentrations dropped during 2020 lockdowns for both the least white and the most white communities. And yet we still saw these persistent disparities where least white communities had NO2 concentrations during lockdowns that still exceeded the NO2 concentrations in the most white communities prior to the lockdowns. And so this indicated to us that these disparities were so large prior to the lockdowns that even the about 50% drop in passenger vehicle traffic that we experienced during the lockdowns were not enough to erase these disparities. So these are just two examples from air quality of how we can use satellite data to explore environmental justice issues. And I'm going to hand it over to Qian now to talk about some of her work studying light at night.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Xiao. I'm from the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. I wish I were here welcoming everyone to Houston, but here we are. I think online is also fine. So following Susan's excellent examples about how we can use satellite data to study environmental justice issues, I also want to give you another example, which is related to my own work, and that focuses on light at night or artificial light at night. And the reason that I'm interested in this topic as a public health researcher is because light at night is a potent disruptor of circadian rhythms and has a wide range of adverse health effects, has been linked with a wide range of diseases from cancer to obesity to mental disorders. And there has been a rapid increase in artificial light at night in the latter half of the 20th century. And as part of our NASA-funded study, we also looked at more recent data using satellite images with a finer resolution, and showing the slide, in the lower left corner, you see this map that shows the changes in light at night in the United States over the last decade. And what we found here is that not all places experienced an increase in light at night, but there are some hotspots where there was a rapid increase in light at night. And interestingly, 6 of the top 10 places or counties that had the highest increase in light at night is in my current home state, Texas. So next slide, please. So more relevant to the theme of this presentation here, I want to talk about why light at night is an environmental justice issue. This is a paper that was published in 2020 that looked at the levels of light at night in different neighborhoods. And they found that neighborhoods with a higher percent of minority population and low SES populations had a higher level of light at night exposure. So next slide, please. So we decided to look at this issue further. The previous study used a relatively limited set of neighborhood characteristics in their analysis, and we decided to take a broader view of neighborhood characteristics. So we looked at the relationship between light at night and the social vulnerability index, which is a composite measure that sort of summarizes many different aspects of the neighborhood. And what we found here, so showing on the first figure here, is a sort of a U-shaped relationship between light at night and social vulnerability. So we divided our counties by light at night into quintiles, and in each quintile looked at the distribution of the social vulnerability index in that light at night quintile. And if you focus on the darker shade, which shows the higher vulnerability neighborhood here, you sort of see this U-shape where the middle quintile of light at night had the highest proportion of neighbor or counties with a high vulnerability. So U-shaped association, and then we looked at, so the social vulnerability index had 4 different components. SES, there's household composition and disability status, there's housing and transportation, and lastly, they have an aspect of the racial ethnic minority and language. So we looked at the relationship with each of those components. And what we saw is really that the shape varies according to which aspect that you are looking at. So for SES and the household composition, you again see this sort of U-shaped association. However, if you look at the 4th figure here, the racial ethnic minority, you see more of a linear trend where definitely the highest quintile of light at night also tend to have the highest portion of racial ethnic minority. And you also see sort of a linear trend for housing condition and transportation as well. So can you advance the slide? There's, yeah, a little box. So just staying, no, go back. Yeah, just a little box. So in conclusion, we found the relationship between light at night and social vulnerability is actually rather complex and not necessarily linear, depend on different components of vulnerability. And as a next step, we're also going to look at rural urban status, which could modify this relationship. And we're also going, so those are county level data, and we're interested in doing analysis at tract level as well. So next slide, please. Another thing I always like to mention as a public health or epidemiologist is this: when we think about an exposure as an environmental justice issue, it's not just about how the distribution of that exposure varies across different neighborhoods, but it's also about the individual responses to that exposure may also be different depending on where you live or what your individual characteristics are. So here's an example taken from a publication that we had about 2 years ago. And we looked at the relationship between light at night and breast cancer risk in a large cohort in the US. And specifically for this figure here, we're dividing our population into two groups. So those women who lived in a low poverty neighborhood and those women who lived in a high poverty neighborhood. What you see here is really for those women who live in a high poverty neighborhood, you see this relationship between light at night and breast cancer risk. In other words, those women living in disadvantaged neighborhoods, it seems they're more likely to develop breast cancer, or they're more vulnerable to the adverse effects associated with higher light at night when it comes to breast cancer risk. We speculated several reasons for this, like poor housing conditions, poor resources, challenging work schedule, and just relatively higher levels of stress. But really, I think the point I want to make here is that individual may respond to the same exposure differently depending on where they are. So in conclusion, I believe light at night is an environmental justice level. Therefore, and this is tied with the mission of our Tiger team as well. Therefore, it's important to identify vulnerable communities that are exposed to this exposure. And also it's important to evaluate interventions that are aimed at reducing this hazard. Next slide, please. So for the last minute or so, I just want to bring your attention back to our Tiger team and talk about our the specific activities we're doing to engage with stakeholders. So we have a multi-phase or multi-stage plan when it comes to communicating with stakeholders, and using the EDF as an example here. So Mindi and Grace, I hope that's okay with you. So in phase 1, we get in touch with our stakeholders. We learn about their work, specifically their climate vulnerability index. We discussed with them about their data needs and priorities. And we also invited them to our team meetings within our Tiger team. And as a phase 2, stakeholders met with our team members within the Tiger team, so not just the coordinators. And they presented their work to the whole group. They learned about specific data that are available in our team, and they made requests about specific data sets when there was a need. And as a next step, we plan to, provide more complete data or complete information on data that is currently available. And we will also facilitate individual meetings with individual HAQAST teams. Next slide. And this is the final slide. So a future plan for our Tiger team, we have completed this phase. We have gathered information about the existing and future satellite data from HAQAST members. We'll keep the more detailed information for internal purposes, and we'll provide summary information to stakeholders for them to learn about our work. We'll again facilitate the meetings. I think Tracy mentioned matchmaking. That's exactly what we do. So meetings between stakeholders and HAQAST team members. And we also plan to provide consultation to stakeholders about satellite use and technical support when there is a need. And we are also going to invite stakeholders to HAQAST meetings and vice versa, invite or introduce environmental justice related meetings to HAQAST members. And then finally, we're also thinking about hosting webinars on various issues related to satellite data and environmental justice. That's all from me.
Thank you, Qian and Susan, for those wonderful talks and keeping them in time. So if you have questions for any of the speaker, please use the question and answer to put out the question, and during the discussion phase towards after all 4 speakers are done, we will take all the questions and have a live discussion. So please continue posting your questions. So our next speaker is Mindi, DePaola and Grace Lewis from Environmental Defense Fund. Please take over.
Thanks, Pawan. Hopefully everyone can see this.
Yes, we can see.
Great. So I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the EJ and air quality work that we do at Environmental Defense Fund, although there is a lot more than we could cover today, and then just specifically focus on a few projects. So my role at EDF is really focused on air quality projects with this environmental justice component. We've begun to really prioritize these projects, and research from EDF and many collaborators attending here have shown that air pollution can vary at this scale. So while there's, like I said, many projects in this portfolio across multiple divisions at EDF, many of which we're collaborating with Susan and Qian on, we'll be focusing on just a few, and also my colleague will probably have more tomorrow in a different panel. So what I'll talk about with this a potential satellite data use case would be Air Tracker. So EDF's been working with partners at Utah and Create Lab at Carnegie Mellon to develop this interactive website that allows the public to see air pollution hotspots in real time. So I'm going to attempt to show this video, and I do have it loaded in case it doesn't work here.
When spending time outside of our homes, our offices, and our schools, we all enjoy breathing fresh air. But there are some things we can't see, things that are harmful to our health. Invisible pollution moves through the air, traveling downwind, damaging our lungs, hearts, and even impacting our brains. Pollution sources may not be right under our noses, but their impacts can be widespread, felt next door, down the street, and across town. What if we could make that pollution and where it comes from visible in real time? We've designed a tool so that you, citizen sleuths, concerned community members, healthcare workers, business owners, regulators, and environmentalists can hold polluters accountable. Built by expert environmental scientists, Air Tracker is a pollutant forensics tool designed to work in any city, detect any pollutant, and integrate into any city's air quality measurement system, all designed to empower people to identify those that pollute our air. Simply select a location to create a backtrace. Darker purple suggests the most likely source of pollution. Lighter shades indicate less likely but still possible culprits. Air Tracker is the first of its kind, combining hyperlocal data with advanced models so that anyone can identify sources of pollution and take action. Learn more about the sources that contribute to air pollution at globalcleanair.org.
So again, that's just a brief overview of this resource led by our senior scientist, Tammy Thompson. So also we'll punt any modeling questions to Tammy and can provide her contact info if you have specific modeling questions on that. And this is what Air Tracker looks like now in Salt Lake City, where our collaborators are located. So you can see, like in the video, the back traces, et cetera. What I'd like to focus on is kind of the next steps for Air Tracker, and again, the potential satellite data uses to build upon this. Moving towards the EJ component of this beyond the obvious, our next steps are working with our community groups in Houston, who we have relationships with through my colleague Grace here and her colleagues on the Houston EDF team. We've already discussed this resource with these groups and are planning focus groups in the coming weeks. And then we're also planning on adding heat maps and weather model performance. Again, just with the EJ section of this, we're committed to this feedback from the communities as a first priority and really trying to change the way that we're building these resources. So we've been engaging with them and will continue to do so as we iterate on this work, because ultimately we want to ensure that these resources are helpful on the ground. So this being said, we think this resource could be even more powerful for our local communities with the addition of what we're proposing is called the Satellite Estimator of Emissions Responsibility Tool. Again, Tammy's really the brains behind leading this proposal, but really building upon the work that's been done with Air Tracker. And this tool could really provide our community stakeholders with actionable information to identify and quantify these sources of health damaging air pollution. And it would not only provide hourly concentrations of the criteria pollutants, but also that affect human health, but also dominant contributors to these concentrations at these scales similar to health data. So the development of this tool will be continuously informed and iterated upon by, again, this community engagement and influence. And the air quality would be derived from the tempo satellite observations using established machine learning techniques that have been used before, and source attribution would be performed using the back trajectory calculations and similar modeling to Air Tracker. So with that, I'm turning this over to my colleague Grace to talk about some of the environmental screening tools that Qian also mentioned.
Thanks, everybody. And next slide, please, Mindi. So today, like, as Qian had mentioned, that we have really been able to begin to capitalize on new tools, satellite data, for instance, in being able to help us to understand where we need to prioritize our efforts and how to use that data in environmental justice work, for instance, in developing screening and mapping tools. And so this is a way that we hope will be able to really focus on the equity and health considerations. And it could be in a variety of different ways, from policy planning, from public health officials to transportation planning, and a variety of different focus areas. Next slide, please. So just to begin with, you are likely all aware of the variety of different environmental justice screening and mapping tools that are beginning to evolve, both on a federal, a state, and on regional and county levels. One of the most popular ones that has been around for some time is the EJ screen from EPA, but as others have mentioned, there are social vulnerability tools, as well as like dashboards, and of course CalEnviro Screen, which has served as a benchmark for a lot of these screening and mapping tools. And today I'm going to talk about our HGB Enviro Screen, as well as our development of our Climate Vulnerability Index. Next slide, please. So we know that EJ screening and mapping tools obviously provide that easy way for the decision makers to visualize and communicate these spatial differences in environment, climate, health, and demographic data, but they may, oops, I think, yeah, there, be limitations in their ability to reflect those regional specific vulnerabilities and being able to quantify and articulate those disproportionate burdens to communities. And so these screening and mapping tools are obviously a way for these community groups to use them for their advocacy and planning, as well as the policymakers to prioritize their resources. However, a lot of these tools don't include community input, and being able to advocate for specific policy requests and looking at cumulative vulnerability really needs to incorporate the lived experiences and the desires for advocacy for community organizations. And so we have tried to do that in some of our work. Next slide, please. So, sorry, as lost my train of thought there. So as part of the data action project that we have in Houston, we wanted to disentangle what factors were contributing to inequity so community groups could develop environmental justice community action plan and prioritize and educate their fellow residents. So this is just some of the way, the methodology that we approach this in collecting and integrating data at the census tract level to create this unitless index score to rank and compare neighborhoods, which we then mapped and looked at the spatial differences of affecting cumulative or overall vulnerability to the communities. And so this allows us to focus on, for instance, the top 15% of census tracts that were the highest ranking reflecting cumulative vulnerability, to designate them as disadvantaged environmental justice areas and prioritize inclusion of these communities in our data to action work in developing their EJ action plans. Next slide, please. So examples of how the screening and mapping tools can be used for decision making are some here on this slide, but really data visualization is a critical component of how we understand those domain-specific and overall vulnerability drivers. So this map on the left shows you, for instance, the ranking of the census tracts, and you can see on the right-hand side that there is like a clustering of the most vulnerable census tracts in areas on the east side of Houston. And this is reflected by a lot of the sources and the combined systemic vulnerability from social health and other factors that contribute to the overall cumulative disadvantage in these communities. Next slide, please. And this is just, again, like a larger perspective of how we are able to look at those domain-specific drivers. So each of the, for instance, the indicators that goes into a specific domain, of which for HGB and virus screen, there are 5, we can look at what is contributing greatest to the vulnerability of the domain and that particular neighborhood. Next slide, please. So we are also currently developing the new climate vulnerability index tool, which expands on HGB and virus screen. And we've been very thankful to have the participation and cooperation help from Gage and Susan and some other folks on the HAQAST team that we've been able to meet with in giving recommendations and accessibility to their data. And this tool expands on our HGB and virus screen work in a similar science-based GIS tool on a national scale. So where HGB and virus screen was for our 8-county region, we are developing the CVI tool to be available at the national scale on the census tract resolution. And so like our previous tool, we'll integrate feedback from environmental justice community leaders from the beginning so that the tool incorporates the data that they need for their advocacy efforts. And we intend this to complement tools like EJ Screen that are currently existing so communities can understand the cumulative impact of both climate, health, environment, and social factors that are driving vulnerability. And we have added into this beyond our initial HGB and virus screen, looking at infrastructure domains, for instance, because we want to really take a cumulative perspective of or I should say a systemic perspective of looking at inequity and factors that also influence resiliency. So we intend this tool to assist our community advocates, but also our key decision makers like ports or planners, local planners or regional planners to assist in how do we try to use these indicators together to focus on where to allocate resources and try to understand where the policies are needed and what could be helping drive those vulnerabilities to address those policy decisions. And that's it.
Thank you, Grace and Mendes. That was great. So our last speaker of the session is Barry Lefer from NASA headquarters. Barry, go on.
Thank you, Pawan, and thank you, everybody. I decided not to put together a slide presentation. I'm a program scientist, program manager, and so the work that you saw here is is really the scientists that are doing all the work and the modelers. It's really exciting. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my program and some of the upcoming opportunities, as well as some of the ideas I see and how we can sort of integrate the research on air quality and with the idea that we can do a better job of evaluating and identifying and evaluating environmental justice in the areas where this is a serious problem. So I manage the tropospheric composition program. So in addition to the applied science program at NASA Earth Sciences, we have 3 other programs. We have the flight program that launches all the satellites. We have the technology program that invests in new technologies. And then there's the research and analysis program. So I'm one of a couple dozen scientists in the research and analysis side. And so I fund work on understanding, I'm just going to pull up our website in front of me, understanding how the atmospheric, the composition of the atmosphere is changing, what trends we have that influence climate, how does atmospheric composition respond to and affect global environmental change, what are the effects of atmospheric composition and climate on regional air quality, and how will future changes in atmospheric composition affect ozone, climate, and global air quality. And so this, of course, why do we care about atmospheric composition? Because of the impact on health. And one of the things that once you start working with satellite data for atmospheric composition, it quickly becomes apparent that we can only measure a handful of things from space. We've got really nice daily maps of NO2 where there's not clouds. And so we tend to have to do some averaging. The SO2 shows up well for very polluted sites and for volcanoes, but fortunately in the United States, the Clean Air Act has done a good job of removing a lot of the SO2 from the atmosphere. So this is getting harder for us to see on a daily basis. We can also see formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is a secondary pollutant. It is air toxic. It's also a good indicator of how the ozone's being formed, or even how the secondary organic aerosols. VOCs is a major problem in understanding environmental justice, and unfortunately, we can't measure benzene, xylene, toluene, ethylbenzene. There's limits to what we can do from space. And again, as you all know, we can measure the total column in the atmosphere, and what we most want to know is what is happening at the surface. And so a lot of the research that I'm interested in is understanding how to turn a column NO2 into a surface NO2, how to take an aerosol optical depth and convert that into a surface PM 2.5. These are not always straightforward questions. And again, the satellites are just part of the solution, as you've heard from the previous speakers. This philosophy of this integrated observing system for air quality, and that is the satellites plus the ground monitors plus the models. And occasionally we get a chance to do a field campaign where we can also have an aircraft doing remote sensing or in situ sampling. Some recent examples are in 2016, we did the FireXAQ campaign in partnership with NOAA. And the two major questions with that were, how can we do a better job of understanding where the smoke plume is going to go and what the composition of the smoke plume is? And so part of that was understanding what's the difference in the composition of the smoke for smoldering versus flaming fires. And to understand that, we were looking at the fire radiative power, the intensity of the fire. So luckily, satellites can not only detect where there's a fire, but also its intensity, which will tell you whether it's a smoldering fire or flaming fire. And then also the height of the smoke plume from the fire, again, determines where it's going to go, because the wind directions are different at different levels in the atmosphere. And so an upcoming field, well, in September, we were in Houston for a month flying with a remote sensing payload with the Tempo airborne simulator, a LiDAR, and well, 2 different LiDARs, one for aerosols and one for ozone. And so these kind of data sets, I think, are really valuable to HAQAST to get high resolution. And the nice thing about this TraceRayQ project is that we took off in the morning, and the aircraft can fly for almost 10 hours. And so we spent a morning, midday, and afternoon map of Houston air quality to sort of simulate what we're going to see from Tempo. So that's another important point, is right now we have this great view of the United States at 1:30 in the afternoon. And so we're really excited about Tempo being able to give us information hourly from sunrise to sunset. We still are missing what's happening at night. And we know that there's exposure at night as well as during the day. And so again, this is where we rely on the models. And hopefully we'll learn a lot by looking at different times of the day. We know that in the morning, the boundary layer is lower. And so there's a lot higher concentration of pollution near the surface from the activities in the early morning rush hour. We really want to improve the models. We want to work with the epidemiologists to understand exposure and help us guide our research. What are the big questions that you had that help us focus on where we can improve the models and improve the satellite products to help you do a better job of mapping air quality exposure and seeing and crosswalking that with the census information. So I was really excited to see Susan and others at the EDF working with EJ Screen and other tools and developing new tools like the air pollution tracker. Just take a quick look at my notes. I think the final thing I wanted to say is that we really do need to work with our other agency partners and our NGOs and the local community. And so one of the ideas I would love to partner with the community with would be a rapid response capability, to have an aircraft that was instrumented with remote sensing and in situ measurement capability, that if there was a hurricane or something that took out a city, or some really bad disaster, explosion of a petrochemical facility, that we could work with our partners at FEMA and EPA to have a rapid response aircraft that could sample in these areas to map the exposure for these communities that live nearby. Am I out of time, Pawan?
Almost. And if you
I'm done.
Okay,
I'm
great.
done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Barry. I think that was a wonderful overview of NASA program. So I think we heard from all our 4 speakers about different aspect of air quality and environmental justice works going on. So what we are going to do now is we'll take some questions. There are already some questions posted. So if you have question, try to put it in chat or question answer window, and we will take one by one. So to get started, I want to raise one quick question of my own to get started the discussion. And this is, I think, to all the speakers, but maybe Susan and Xiao can probably chime in a little bit more. One of the things, Susan, you mentioned that satellite data are kind of a new player in the game of addressing environmental justice, specifically for air quality. So as we are developing new satellite product data sets, what the biggest challenge you face when you're using the satellite data? Do you have right piece of information from the satellite? Are you looking more where we stand in terms of the status of satellite data? How ready are they to address EJ type of issues?
That's a great question. Sorry, my camera just did this right before the talk too. So I'll answer the question and then maybe come out and back in to get my camera working. That's a great question. I have a couple answers to that. We've made some massive improvements in satellite remote sensing and the data that we can derive from them. And that's really why I think that the application to environmental justice is relatively new, because we're just now starting to get to the geographical scales that are needed to address these within city differences. But we're not there yet. So, we are getting down to, say, 1 kilometer resolution for several of these large scale pollution data sets for PM 2.5 and for NO2. And 1 kilometer is fantastic. I mean, the data that I showed for PM 2.5 and for NO2 for this environmental justice research applications, that was using 1 kilometer data. That said, some of the data that are going into creating those 1 kilometer data sets are more coarsely resolved. And so we're not really capturing all the information that, are all the factors that are driving the spatial variation within cities in terms of pollution levels. So I would say spatial resolution continues to be something that we need to continue to advance. That's one thing. And then the second thing is whether we are measuring the right pollutants. And, this actually gets to some of the questions that came up also in the Q&A that we'll get to later, but talking about formaldehyde, for example, we held a listening session prior to the launch of our Tiger team, a community public listening session to try to understand what are the challenges that people are experiencing right now and try to link that up with what we can bring with satellite data. And, we shared our information about nitrogen dioxide and what we can do with nitrogen dioxide. And some of the comments we got back, rightfully so, were, this is very good and useful, but we also very much care about air toxics and diesel PM and some of these, things that we know are varying at very small scales within cities, but perhaps aren't being measured. And Barry talked about this as well. So how do we use some of what we can measure from satellite data and what we are measuring on the ground and integrate that to try to, I want to say make educated guesses, but I think we can do better than that. Try to infer something about the other pollutants that are of concern at the community scale.
Thanks, Susan. Anybody else from the panel wants to add anything?
Yeah, Susan did a great job, and it's really using the satellite constraints to help the satellite information to help constrain the model, so that the satellites can really help put a top-down constraint on the emission inventories, especially for certain sectors. There's some new papers that came out recently showing how the high-resolution NO2 data for Houston, they were able to see, and actually other cities as well, they're able to see the diesel trucks at the ports. And that was, by comparing weekday to weekend, and the difference between that kind of highlighted that emission source, so they can infer something about the diesel soot emissions from those trucks. And so I think we're always going to be relying on the models, but if we can make the models better by the satellite data, and this also helps inform these field campaigns where we could really focus on air toxics or focus on some of these sources to help partition between how much of the NOx is coming from large point sources versus mobile sources, those kinds of questions.
Thanks, Susan and Barry. So let me go quickly to the question which we are getting from our participants. So one of the first question, I think from Sarah Johnson, how did you downscale to census tract in urban areas where tracts are pretty small? I think this is to Susan and Qian.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Great question. And so as we know, census tracts are optimized for the number of people living within them and not area. So they are quite variable depending on where you are in the country. We tackled this in our nitrogen dioxide paper during COVID-19 lockdowns to try to understand how many grid cells or how many census tracts across the United States really fall into this category of being smaller scale than 1 kilometer resolution. it's pretty limited to just the inner urban areas in a few cities. Of course, New York is one of them, as you would expect. So very densely populated downtown areas. But of course, those are very popular. Those are very important areas to try to discern. So, for most of the country, 1 kilometer works very well. 1 kilometer is smaller or akin to the size of a census tract, but in those downtown, very densely populated urban areas in New York or San Francisco, some of those census tracts are smaller than 1 kilometer. So in that case, we interpolated with using the grid cells around that census tract. So we took an inverse distance weighting approach using the 8 grid cells around that census tract. So what that does is probably smooths out some of the spatial variation within the downtown urban area, but we still do get some of the information from the neighboring grid cells.
Hey, Susan, I was going to say we could probably test that interpolation with some of the Tempo airborne simulator data we have for New York City during Listos. So I think that resolution is 250 meter or 50 or 500 meter. And so we have some coincident tropomi overpasses. Of course, a single day of tropomi is not at high resolution. So I guess it's not so straightforward. We need like a month of, what's your temporal averaging on your 1 kilometer data? Is it an annual or is it a monthly?
I think for the purposes of that study, it was a little bit less than annual. But I think this gets to the crux of the matter in terms of spatial resolution, is that we need higher resolution than 1 kilometer to discern what is happening within densely populated urban areas. And of course, that's where traffic is contributing a lot to the pollution levels. So these are very important areas. We can, the study that I showed was just using tropomi columns and did not attempt to convert to surface NO2. But we do have some ways to convert to surface NO2 in a way that also improves spatial resolution by using land use variables like proximity to roadways, of course. And so, we do have some approaches to get at this, but they are estimation approaches as opposed to observation.
Great, thanks, Susan and Barry. So let me get to a question for Mendes and Grace on this is from Carl Molling. The EDF air tractor tools look very interesting. Is this a currently active tool or is still in development? And what will be the spatial coverage of the tool? Partner cities only, or national or global? So if you can comment on that.
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's kind of currently active, but like you said, we're currently iterating with our focus groups and community groups and governmental folks in Houston. So it's kind of active in a really small set right now, but we hope to have an official launch in the coming months. Is pushed back a little bit, but the spatial coverage of the tool is cities that we can work with local groups. We're prioritizing that. So if you have a city that you work with some local community groups and or government folks and think it would be useful, contact us. I'll reply to the question and I can but it's airtracker@edf.org. Thanks.
Thank you. So our next question is from, let's see, from Shobha, and I think this is from Susan and Sean. Are there plans to expand EJ studies using tropomi and tempo for formaldehyde products to understand its toxicity and as a cancer-causing pollutant?
I'm happy to say that I think it's the next logical step. It's a great question. As Shobha knows, the formaldehyde data, formaldehyde's a secondary pollutant, and so it does have a short lifetime like NO2, but it's a secondary pollutant. It has a variable lifetime, so it's a weaker absorber. So the bottom line is it's a noisier product, and so it'll take more averaging. But I think and one of the nice things about tempo is we have the opportunity to stare since we're in geostationary orbit, and so we might be able to get a better signal. We're hoping to get a better signal of tropomi from tempo than we currently get from tropomi at a similar spatial resolution. And so let's keep our fingers crossed. But I think we should be looking at annual average tropomi now just to see what other surprises we have with formaldehyde.
Thanks, Barry.
I can add to that, just to add to that, it's a great question, Shobha. And I think this falls under the category of, there are some ways in which we can use satellite data right now to explore overburdened communities, to identify overburdened communities and explore how to reduce pollution or reduce environmental health risk factors. There are others that are still a little bit more in nascent stages in terms of the research phase. And I think that's probably one of them, but we still need a lot of research, as Barry was indicating, to understand how long to average the formaldehyde products and then how to use them together with health data. And so, we have been thinking about how to link the formaldehyde products with nitrogen dioxide to try to identify the sources of combustion and who's exposed. But I think that just looking at exposure to formaldehyde itself as well is a great idea.
Great, thanks, Susan. So I think we have another quick question, and this is to all of you. I'm curious about the process of collaborating with the environmental justice leaders. While this is a critical, it can also be burdensome, specifically for small organization with limited budget and staff time. How are you thinking about compensating EJ leaders for their time and expertise in consulting on the project? So this is more a general question, and I think maybe we may not have a direct answer, but I'm definitely sure there are channels for collaborating. So if anyone you want to elaborate on it.
I can start kind of with the point of view that we're taking. So I know specifically for the Climate Vulnerability Index, we've provided our environmental justice community-based organizations with pass-through grants. And the folks on the ground in Houston, like I said, Grace and team are actively engaged with them to support them regularly. And that was before CVI and will continue through CVI. We do always want to make sure we're compensating them for their time. And we find that if we have these conversations before we have the tool, and it kind of goes to another question that I think I saw in the Q&A of communities not wanting to be monitoring to death, they kind of go hand in hand, is that if we start these conversations and really co-lead from the very beginning of the project, we can really do the science in a different way and have it be more helpful and not come to them after the fact with the tool. And so they also have a lot more buy-in and reason to help us improve this resource.
Great, thank you. Anyone else wants to add on that or have other aspects? I think that generally through HAQAST, whatever work we are doing through HAQAST on EJ, anyone is welcome to collaborate, and I think they can write to Susan or Xiao or any HAQAST team member to actually participate on any of the projects, and the channel is there.
I'll make a quick comment.
Barry, you were saying something? Sorry, I missed.
No, I'm sorry. Sorry for speaking over you, Pawan. A quick comment.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. You were muted.
Two things. This new EJ call, I think you're required to have local stakeholders involved in the proposal and presumably co-funded in the proposal. But in a larger NASA Earth Science Division has had a long policy for open data, but now we have a policy for open science, open source science. And so along that it's not only does our data have to be freely available as soon as possible and shared, we kind of have we're opening up our science teams, and we're opening up the code that we use to process the data and the tools we develop. And even the hardware we developed, we want to open source all of it and let anybody use the code, modify the code, make the tools better. And so it's part of our diversity, inclusion, and transparency efforts. And so it's going to apply to HAQAST as well. And so we my policy, if anyone wants to be on the science team and attend the science team meetings, it's open, like this HAQAST meeting is open to anyone who wants to register. So.
So I just want to add on that. I make aware everyone that there is also call out from EPA currently asking for air quality monitoring supports at different scales, and that is pretty big call. It's out right now. Any communities or environmental justice leaders wants to propose to that, that's another opportunity out there currently. And I see Tracy's hands up. Go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I just wanted to say, I think that's a really great question, and it is a different way of engaging with stakeholder partners than we've historically done through NASA HAQAST, because I think with big organizations like state agencies or the EPA or the CDC, I think the idea is that they have a lot of bandwidth and data and analytics in-house, and that the role of our NASA team is just to sort of be training them and getting them up to speed. But I think when working with environmental justice partners and community groups, it is a different story where their time needs to be compensated more directly with funding. And so I think that that has changed, at least for me, how I work with partners from an EJ perspective. And I think that these opportunities for funding, it's just, I think it is a different way of working and a different way of budgeting the work with environmental justice groups. It's good to say, recognize explicitly. So I appreciate the question.
Thanks, Tracy. So I think just building on this discussion, a lot of this discussion and talk which we just saw focused more on the domestic US issues and how we are addressing them here. I was wondering specifically with this question is to Mindy's and Grace, as environmental defense work globally on these issues. So I was wondering if you have a global perspective on how other countries or other parts of the world are taking this EJ issues, and are they at a point where satellite data can be used in those places where the ground monitoring is limited, or how do you see the whole satellite data playing out in the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't work so much internationally at EDF, but in prior work internationally within this space, I think that particularly in low and middle income countries and the work that's on the ground there, something that I think could be really improved upon is the what's called citizen science generally, although I take a little bit of I have a little bit of a problem with that term, but the citizen scientists on the ground, overlapping this on the ground data with the satellite data can be, I think, really powerful as we move forward, particularly because, with all this EJ work, we want to take the lead, like I said, of the local groups, and we're not always on the ground. That listening to what they're seeing and what they're noting on the ground with their observations and what their needs are, and then having the satellite data help inform based on what they're seeing, is my perspective on that from just previous work.
Yeah, but I like to add to this as well that this is an area that there's a real strength of the satellite data that we have, at least the polar orbiting satellite data that we have, is that we have global coverage. And so all of the methods that our team has been working on applies anywhere, really. And so we can do these estimates of pollution levels and have done that all over the world. Where it starts to differ is that, of course, we have much more data in the US, especially ground monitoring, than other countries might have. And so we have potentially more ground truthing of some of the data in the US than other parts of the world. But in many places, these are the only data available to really draw from. And we, of course, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think that it's very valuable information to have. So we've just produced estimates of PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide concentrations in about 13,000 cities worldwide, just as an example, and made that data available to anyone who is interested. And in most of these cities, that's the first time that there are estimates at the urban scale of pollution levels without ground monitoring there. So of course, we would love to have more ground monitoring, but while we wait for that to happen, it would be super nice to have some satellite-based estimates as well. And going back to what Mindi said, it's very important also to have the local perspective on these estimates. And one of the most fruitful things that we've been doing in my group is to interact with local officials or local researchers and get their feedback, like, oh my gosh, this doesn't make sense at all. This is totally out of line with the levels that we thought that we had, and your estimate is probably too high, or your estimate is probably too low. And that's totally fine. We don't expect them to match, but what we do want is that feedback so that we can actually go through the process of understanding why they don't match and how do we improve these satellite-based estimates using that local information, and how can the local stakeholders improve their information availability by perhaps setting up monitors or developing new, locally specific models that can generate estimates of pollution levels in those areas.
Thanks, Susan. So I think we have about 5 more minutes left and we have a few more questions. So I will quickly go to 2 technical questions. One is, I think for Mindy's and Grace, does the new tool use real-time actual air quality measurement data, or just the use emission inventories and model? What are the air quality like based on nearby sources or meteorological conditions? So it's a little bit technical question.
Yeah, I can answer to the best of my ability and then forward you to the Air Tracker email. But Air Tracker uses publicly available maps and then uses AirNow air quality data, which is a partnership between the federal, state, and local air quality agencies. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to specifically answer the question, so I need to look at that again. Okay, so yeah, and so it will do it at certain time periods. So when you go on to Air Tracker, you can go back and it's by the hour. It will update again through these partnerships. We also use Purple Air and Clarity monitors as their those networks, since they're 2 of the most common low-cost monitors. And then in Salt Lake City, we're also using Trax, which is a light rail system, and that has monitors on it as well. So it'll update as often as all of those networks of monitors are updating. And then in terms of weather data, Air Tracker pulls real-time wind direction and wind speed data, mostly from AirNow stations.
Great, thanks. And I think next question is from Baron Henderson from EPA, and this is for Xian. What type of variability in nightlight did different EJ groups get exposed to? Was there a difference in range or variance in neighborhoods scale?
Yeah, so I was actually putting on my comments there, just trying to get a clarification from Baron. But I think the question is about not just the average levels of light at night, but also the variability people get either temporally or geographically. The variability aspect of the exposure also plays a role here, if I understand the question correctly. And I say, this is a great question. We don't know. I don't recall any public health study that specifically focused on the variability piece. However, that's exactly what we are planning to do with our data set as well, because now we do have multiple years and we have fine resolution. So this will allow us to answer this question in our data set. This, just stay tuned, and we'll probably have some new data to share. So yeah.
Hey, Pawan, I just wanted to make 2 quick comments. One is that there is a sister to Tempo called GEMS over Asia right now. And NASA's been working closely with the Korean Environmental Protection Agency that's operating the satellite. The data is not quite public yet, but we're planning in 2024 to visit 4 megacities in Asia to work with the local communities to help them understand how to use this data to understand their air quality problems, as well as the government agencies. But it's right now we're looking at Seoul, Hanoi, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Bangkok, Calcutta. We won't be able to do all of this, but we're trying to find cities where we have good connections with the folks on the ground. And then the second thing I wanted to say is another really good use of the satellite data is to identify problem areas. Just there's something going on here, and that's a good place for citizen scientists or state agencies to put a monitor to better document the 24/7 situation, because the satellites are not measuring all the time. But anyway, just 2 thoughts.
Thanks. So I think we are nearing our time, but I want to encourage all the panelists to respond remaining questions through the chat or question answer in writing. If you can do that, that will be helpful. Also, just since we're closing, if anyone has any closing couple of sentences they want to say about whole EJ issues, Susan or Mindy's or Xiao, anyone wants to close with session with a couple of sentences or closing remark?
Yeah, I would love to do that, Pawan. Just from the satellite data for environmental justice Tiger team, if anyone is interested in that, please do reach out to me and Qian, and we'd be happy to share more information.
Great, thanks. Mindy's, Grace, do you guys have any final thoughts?
I think my final thought is, again, just to go back to that question of how we view our work leading these interventions, and really we're trying to flip that totally in terms of who's leading and who's co-leading and who's helping who, and really changing the script on that science when we're doing this work, whether it be with satellite data or our other resources, and working hand in hand from the very beginning to help make it more just and equitable. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I think we are on time now, and thank you all the speakers for. Barry, you are muted.
I'm sorry, Pawan. I wanted to say one more thing. First of all, what Mindy said is 100% correct.
Go ahead.
But in addition to the environmental justice call, we now have a call on the streets. It's Rose's A51 that is for minority serving institutions. And so some of you might be from minority serving institutions, but it's to put ground monitoring network instruments at a minority serving institution. So this is the Pandora instrument I talked about, or the AeroNet instrument, or a precipitation monitoring instrument. And so if anyone has questions about that, please reach out to me. I'll post a link to that Rose's call in the chat.
Thanks, Barry. That was a great reminder. So again, I would like to thank you all the 4 speakers for wonderful presentation and all the questions from the participation and the discussion. I think it was really helpful. Thank you again, everyone. And Jenny, do we have any closing words?